find such a love at our age. Whoever thought we could dance on a thrilling new
Welcome to
stage.
Couples Therapy in 7 Words. I am your co-host, Judy Alexander, and I'm here with my husband, Dr. Bruce Chalmer.
Hello, Judy. Hello, viewers and listeners. Judy, what's today's topic?
Radical moderation, an interview with Professor Lauren Hall.
So let's get on with that. We're going to send you right to that interview right now of the fascinating interview, and we will see you on the other side.
Our guest today is Professor Lauren Hall. Professor Hall describes herself as an author, speaker, professor, wife and mother, university administrator, and haphazard gardener. She is a professor of political science and associate dean of academic affairs at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Her books include Family and the Politics of Moderation and The Medicalization of Birth and Death, and her book in progress is called Radical Moderation, Living in Four Dimensions. She also serves on the board of advisors of the Pro-Human Foundation. Lauren, welcome to Couples Therapy in 7 Words.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have you. So we always like to start off with our guests asking, tell us something about your own journey. How did you end up in the work you do? And, tell us something about that.
It will be deeply unsatisfying. I went to, I was a philosophy major in college and just knew I wanted to keep going to school. So I went to grad school. And then once you're in a PhD program in political theory, you go into academia because that's what you that's the pathway you're on. I actually at one point when I was in high school wanted to be a zoologist. I still don't quite know what happened to that one, but so I got interested in political theory because I find just questions of how humans live together to be really fascinating. So for me, that's kind of the, how do we live together in communities relatively peacefully, is sort of one of the questions that animates a lot of the work that I do.
Well, I have to say, you're like right up Bruce's alley with this radical moderation, a phrase that he absolutely loves. So can you talk to us about, tell us what radical moderation is for our listeners out there?
Sure. So the term actually came from a car ride that my husband and I took probably 6 years ago, and we were sort of bemoaning the state of politics even at that point, and the sort of not just politics, but my husband's a dietitian. And so I think we see this in nutrition. We see this in exercise science. We see this in relationships. There's this kind of black and white advice out there. It's just sort of, you're constantly being hit by these extremes of either you go, keto, or you do some sort of high carb thing, or right. I mean, and it struck me that we're really stuck in what I call this sort of binary choice model where you have to choose this or this, and there's no context, there's no color, it's all just sort of black and white choices. And so when my husband and I were kind of puzzling through, we just felt like none of the parties represented what we really stood for. None of the other political platforms really stood for what we were for. And what we really wanted to think about is how to think about sort of human social life in all four dimensions. So I talk a lot on the Substack that I write on, that we actually need to think in all four dimensions. We need to break out of this binary, this one-dimensional binary. And that's when we get context, and that's when we get complexity, and that's when we get sort of the full, sort of broad landscape of human lives. And it makes it a lot more complicated, but it also makes it richer, and it also makes it, I think, more meaningful, and you get closer to real solutions to human problems.
As Judy was saying, I don't know if I've used that exact term. I've used very similar terms. I love the idea that it's not just moderation, it's radical moderation, because there is something radical in our current, well, not just current climate, this has been true for a long time, about insisting that there are nuances, that things just aren't black and white. That is not a mushy or sort of, timid position. That actually it's a radical position in some ways. I have to tell you my favorite slogan, which I've been saying for years, what do we want? Moderation. When do we want it? When it's appropriate. It somehow doesn't quite get the mob going, but
Right. Well, and this is something, when I was thinking about moderation, I didn't want to bring back sort of moderation itself, because I think you're absolutely right that people do associate it with just, well, it's just an easy choice, right? There's point
Mm,
A and point B, and moderation is just choosing the middle, right? So it's sort of easy, it's thoughtless, it's just, a kind of lazy approach. Whereas I think of radical moderation as actually being really hard. It's really hard because you're asking people to grapple with complexity, you're asking them to grapple with nuance. But and so it's radical. It's not taking these 2 points for granted. It's really exploding the binary altogether and getting back into this four-dimensional space.
mm.
What do you mean by four-dimensional? I've
Yeah,
heard of the
so the
fifth
way that
dimension. I've heard of three
yeah,
dimension.
so the three dimensions kind of are, the normal length, breadth, depth, and I use those to think about sort of the ways that people move around their own are, we all share a sort of landscape, a social, political, and moral landscape that we're all traveling in different kinds of ways, but it's a shared landscape. We all are on the same sort of space. But the three dimensions really refer to like sort of how hard it is to navigate your specific, whatever path you're on. The kinds of choices that you have to make might be different than the ones that you have to make in a different kind of space. The fourth dimension is one that I think we often ignore when we talk about political and social problems, but it's so important, and that's the element of time. So time is
Mm.
the fourth dimension. And time, I think, operates in a couple different really important ways. There's historical time, which obviously creates constraints that we can't easily get out of. The history of the United States is very different from the history of, say, France. And so we have different historical constraints that make our system different from France's. But there's also developmental time. So my kids are, every year they change and they grow and they become slightly different humans than they were the year before. And then there's just lifespan time. When I think about myself when I was 20 versus how I think and my values now that I am 44, I have a totally different kind of value set. And it's not because I've dramatically changed in terms of, like, I'm not a moral relativist or anything, but it just, I have kids now. I have people who depend on me. I have a home. So time, I think, is a really crucial component of conversations, but we often leave it out because we're so focused on the present when we talk about sort of moral and political and social issues.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that one of the elements of recognizing time as an important dimension, I think it has a lot to do with that willingness to allow oneself to change, to allow, as you described, you change over the lifespan, you have experiences. I'm a couples therapist. This is, of course, a podcast about that. Judy, we like to say I'm the therapist. Judy's the real person. Judy is a retired educator, not a therapist. But in working with couples, they often come in very polarized, and
Mm-hmm.
if that's kind of the norm, not the exception. And a lot of my work is about inviting them into that stance of radical moderation, where they
Mm-hmm.
can actually hear each other. And one of the things I think in the time dimension, one of the things that gets in the way of that is when people are so when you feel like if I were to change my stance here, I would be betraying my past. I would be, like you
Right.
mentioned, moral relativism, oh, I don't want to be a moral relativist, but what if I'm looking at things differently now? Damn, maybe I have to
Mm-hmm.
learn something, that can be a
Yep.
hard thing for people to accept.
Yeah, I mean, so I've been married for 15 years, and it is one of those interesting. I mean, my husband and I actually talk about this a lot, that the people we were when we got married are not the same people that we are now.
Yeah.
We
Right.
didn't have kids then. We didn't have, I mean, just all of the sort of variables that come to into anyone's life. But we also just, people grow within a relationship. And
Hmm.
so, it is, I think, something that we don't often give ourselves enough room to do, but we also often don't give other people enough room to do it too.
Yeah. Yeah, it is definitely a challenge to folks when they bump into that sort of unexpected, which which sometimes tends to happen as well. So,
Mhm.
speaking of, relationships, that's one thing I noted in your resume, so to say, or in your vita, that you're a political scientist, but you've written quite a lot about how that applies in relationships, not just, sort of large
Mhm.
systems, but also small systems like families and couples and things like that. Could you speak about that? How'd you get into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the my first book was called Family and the Politics of Moderation, as you pointed out. And one of the things that I was really interested in doing in that book was there was a kind of puzzle that I noticed in political theory, which is that families sort of don't exist in the history of sort of, if you look at sort of most major political theorists don't take the family seriously,
Mm,
or if they do, they have to figure out a way to sort of get rid of the family. And so what I was trying to understand is what role do families play in political and social communities, and why is it that political theories have such a hard time dealing with them? And what I found was that the sort of extremes of political theories, whether sort of radical individualism or radical communitarianism, they they sort of bring specific values above all else. So in a collectivist or communitarian group, the group is more important than anything else. In an individualist society, that the individualist sort of takes primacy over everything else. And in both of those cases, the family, because it's this really fascinating place where individuals are individuals within communities, and they're also communities of individuals. You're really only known as an individual kind of within the family or very close friendships. And so, and then not to mention the developmental part, which is, if you look at how children develop, they develop their individuality via social interactions. There's been a lot of interesting psychological research, I'm sure you've run across it, about children who are denied social inputs and they
oh
don't
yeah.
develop normally. Their brains actually sort of, they don't grow. And so, in order to be an individual, we actually need to have communities. We need to have healthy communities. We need to have this constant interaction between individuals and communities to truly get the best of both. And so when you have really sort of extreme political theories that focus on just the individual or just the community at the expense of the other, the family doesn't fit anymore. And so if you look at, for example, the sort of early egalitarian Marxist thinking, they actually the children were raised communally because they were worried that the family creates this bond that pulls people away from the group. But the
Mm.
same thing happens on the individualists, right? So if you look at people like Ayn Rand, right, she all of her families are deeply toxic, and all of her characters have to escape their families in order to become true individuals. So there's
Mm.
this really like interesting problem, and so I think the family actually it provides this really powerful moderating influence. Now, this isn't to say that families are obviously the location of abuse and neglect, and I mean there's like every human institution, families are imperfect, but they do play this really interesting moderating role. And so, if you look at sort of utopian societies, they always really struggle with what to do with the family.
Mm. Yeah, the whole concept of utopianism is that the notion of absolutes that, well, we can get
Yep.
it exactly right. We can set up principles that will work all the time. And of course,
Yep.
families come along and they just don't, do they? And it's so interesting. I hadn't thought of that until we're just having this conversation. It's like one way of looking at I suppose one way of looking at why I find couples work especially so fascinating is that all of my favorite theories are imperfect.
Yep.
The subtitle, not the most recent book I wrote, but the one before, the title of the book was "It's Not About Communication," and the subtitle is "Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy Is Wrong." And I point out in that book that that applies to me too. Everything I know about couples therapy is wrong too. And we just described in hearing what you were saying, it's like, oh, no wonder, because anything we know won't always work. And families are
Yep.
such a wonderful illustration of that. It just all the great, whatever our most cherished principles are, they work except when they don't.
Well,
And
that's
families,
because they
yeah,
don't always fit that mold.
yeah,
You know, they
it's,
don't fit any mold.
you're dealing with an identity that isn't just individual, but it's not
Yep.
just corporate. It's sort of somewhere in between. Yeah, I
Mhm.
hadn't thought of that stuff. Yeah.
Mm.
Hmm. So in so you've applied sort of the political theories, and you've tried to broaden the field of political science. It's interesting as you were describing that, it occurred to me there's an analogy popped in my mind between what you're doing with political science, about which I frankly know very little. I mean, let me put my lack of qualification right on the table. I've read what I've read, but not that much. But it reminded me of an analogy of what Daniel Kahneman did to economics.
Mhm.
Founding behavioral, because it reminded me when you were talking about how political science doesn't know what to do with the family. It's like, yeah, economics had this concept of human beings that actually don't exist. And it took Kahneman and Tversky to come along and say, oh, actually, real people don't behave according to, Homo economicus. That's
Yeah.
just not how it works. You're sort of
Yep.
doing the same thing for political science, it seems like.
Well, I would love to be in the same group as as Kahneman, but I
Mm,
do think that and I think this is true of all of the disciplines. I think there's real benefits to a disciplinary lens where you really drill down on a specific problem using all of your analytic focus, but then you have to back up and realize that you're actually still looking at humans in their full sort of context. And that's where I
mm,
think economics went awry, and that's where I think those sort of more modern economists really pulled things back in and said, well, wait a second, if your economics only works in an equation, and when you put it out in the real world it stops working, then maybe it's not a useful economics. And the same thing is true
mm,
of political science. The same thing is true of psychology. I mean, there
hmm.
was a lot of this in psychology too. You would do things in the lab and then you do it in the real world, and then totally different things happen.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
So
very true. So, could you tell us about your work with Pro Human Foundation? I will mention for our listeners our rather oblique connection, but we do have that through my son, who is a Pro Human Foundation ambassador. And in fact, I first learned about the Pro Human Foundation through him because we interviewed Wilk
Well,
Wilkinson,
right.
who is also on the board of the Pro Human Foundation. And then come to find out, we happened to be talking to my son Seth, and he said, "Oh yeah, I know him through the Pro Human Foundation." Anyway, please tell us about that. How'd you get interested in that, and what do you do?
yeah, thanks. I actually met the Pro Human Foundation folks at a pluralism summit that was hosted by the Mercatus Foundation. I'm one of their pluralism fellows for the year. And
Can I just interrupt you?
Yeah,
Can you explain what the Pro Human Foundation is for our listeners who might not be familiar with it?
yes. So the Pro Human Foundation is a very new foundation. I believe it was just actually founded in 2024. And one of the goals of the Pro Human Foundation is it actually dovetails really, really nicely with my goals in radical moderation, which is one of the goals of the Pro Human Foundation is to get out of the polarization and the sort of partisanship and these boxes and silos that people put themselves in, and instead develop a pro-human approach. What is it that humans need to flourish? What is it that humans need to come together and solve problems collaboratively and cooperatively? A couple of their principles, and if I can pull it up, I'll read all 8. But they have sort of these core principles, and one of which there's a couple that really dovetail perfectly with work that I'm doing. One of which is gratitude. I think in a lot of our sort of hyper negative political environment, we've forgotten how lucky we are to be in the space that we are right now. As challenging as it is, it's a better world than it was 200 years ago by almost every metric. It's really hard to look at like the public health data and say that we haven't made strides in 200 years. I mean, like there's just all sorts of things that we should be grateful for. But it was started by Daryl Davis, who many folks
Mm,
know, really wonderful, talented, incredibly talented jazz musician, musician across the board. But he also became famous for befriending, as a Black man, KKK members.
yeah.
And one of the things that he did was just listen. He would go and he didn't walk in belligerently asking them why they were KKK members. That would be the natural thing to do if you were in his position, but he didn't. He tried to sort of connect with them on a human level. And I can't remember what the total is. I think he has like over
It's
200
it's in the
robes.
200s, at least according to Wilk
Well,
Wilkinson
yeah.
when we asked him. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, of people who've left the KKK because of their experience with Daryl. And so this goes back to, I think, one of those really crucial points that I think couples there like to relate sort of couples therapy with my own work. I think politics and relationships, I mean, you absolutely have to get down to relationships between people who know each other. I
Yeah.
think so many of us are stuck in this keyboard warrior kind of space where we see something online and we react to it, and so there's this reactivity, but also we're not actually engaging with each other as human beings. So part of
Hmm.
what the Pro Human Foundation is really working to get people to do is teaching people how to engage as human beings again. So they have a K through 12 curriculum that I think they're in the process of finalizing right now. And then they have these wonderful pro-human ambassadors who are out there doing just incredible work in their communities. And a lot of this work is it's about building relationships. It's about being curious and listening to other people's stories. It's about not making assumptions. You could look at a KKK member, and I think you would be, I mean, it's understandable why people do this, but you could look at a KKK member and say, this is just a terrible person. But Daryl didn't do that, right? Daryl actually went in and said, there's something else going on. I want to know a little bit more about who this person is.
Yeah.
And that takes an enormous amount of courage. Yeah, go ahead.
It absolutely does. And I, the 7 words of our podcast, Couples Therapy in 7 Words, are be kind, don't panic, and have faith. And the have faith part, and the way I define faith, it's not necessarily religious faith. It's that sense you start with the assumption that everybody involved, and of course I do this in couples therapy all the time, everybody involved isn't crazy, stupid, or evil. Probably.
Yes.
I say probably.
Yes.
In 30 years of doing it, how many people have I met where I'm saying, oh, I see the problem here. This person is just an asshole. Not many. We're all capable of being assholes, but mostly we don't really mean to be. And
Yes.
so, and that had to have been, I mean, I haven't talked to Daryl Davis, that had to have been how he was approaching those KKK members. Okay, these are human beings. They have a context. They have their experiences. They have reasons for getting where they got to. Wonder what that's about. He went in with curiosity rather than with, curious rather than furious. And that's what happens in couples therapy too. When people can actually be invited to that place. And I like to refer to where I'm trying to get them to as the oh shit moment. And what I mean by the oh shit moment, it's not like you just hit your thumb with a hammer. It's, oh shit, that's where you're coming from. And I call it the oh shit moment rather than the aha moment, because the aha moment's a solution. Lovely when you get there. But first, the oh shit moment is, oh shit, I don't know how to solve this, but at least I know where you're coming from. And you can see where I'm coming from. We still aren't, sometimes the oh shit moment leads them to say, oh wow, we're two good people, but it's not going to work. Or it might invite them to say, wait a minute, there's a whole other way of looking at this. And that again fits in my definition of radical moderation. It's like there must be something, I call it faith. There must be something meaningful here. Even if it seems crazy or to me, or I don't understand it, or it's bad or whatever, there's something meaningful happening. If we could actually explore that, we'll probably get someplace. Yeah.
One of the things I do in my American politics class, or at least I did, I'm not teaching as much these days, but I would have students read sort of classic texts from progressives, libertarians, and conservatives. And the idea was to give them a good faith understanding of what these folks who believe this collection of beliefs are trying to do. And I had a student who came up to me at the end of one class, and he said, and I had them read Russell Kirk, who's one of the sort of founding American conservatives in the 1950s. And I had them read Russell Kirk's 10 Principles of Conservatism, very short piece. You can find it easily online. And he came up to me after class and he said, thank you so much for having us read that. I thought conservatives had no principles at all. And it was, but it opened my eyes again to the fact that this stuff is worth doing. If you're a conservative and you look at progressives and you think that they just want to destroy America, like you're obviously not, why don't you ask them what their goals are? Now, to your point, this doesn't mean that you're going to be best friends, and it doesn't mean that you're all going to come together and agree. That's not the goal. The goal is just to stop viewing people as enemies, stop viewing them in bad faith and assuming that they have dishonest or cruel intentions, or that they're idiots, right? Stop believing that people are either evil or stupid. And instead realize that people have different values. And then you can start having actually meaningful conversations. And this is true, I think, across the political spectrum. Now, especially, we view each other as enemies. But having faith is so important.
We're pausing with our interview just to bring you a few words about our books.
Absolutely. And, in this particular one we're doing today, I do mention this book.
Betrayal and Forgiveness, How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again.
Yeah, one of the things Professor Hall asked, and depending on where this goes in the interview, you may have already seen it or you may not, is some of the problems that couples I work deal with, and betrayal is certainly one of them.
And another
And
topic we talk about is ideas and ideology, which you can find in this book. It's not about communication, why everything you know about couples therapy is wrong.
yep, and the one that started it all, as you like to say,
Right? Reigniting the spark, why stable relationships lose intimacy and how to get it back.
and we would be remiss in our advertising of our books if we don't mention
Yes,
your book.
because you have to have an erotic break from your life. Not everything is serious. You just got to go on and have some sex. So that's why there's the Blue Tent Erotic Tales from the Bible. Actually, we do talk about religion in this interview.
We do.
So if you want to learn about religion,
Well, I will say, with respect to that book, if you already know about religion or the characters involved in the Bible, it enhances the book.
it certainly does.
That book is a pretty exciting book, even if you don't know anything about those characters, but especially if you do. So, yeah, do get a hold of those books. You can get them anywhere books are sold. If you go to Amazon.com, of course, they're all available there. And I especially invite you to do reviews. Those of you who have read our books, to do reviews. We're really looking for reviews. That just makes it more accessible to folks. First of all, Amazon shows it to more people, and moreover, when somebody clicks on that and they see there've been a bunch of reviews, it says, "Oh, this is the real thing," so people are actually reviewing it. So thank you for that. And now back to our interview. Yeah.
And that's the importance of education. Certainly, a liberal arts education is to expose people to the difference of opinions, and there are such differing opinions. And I think in our social media age, we're getting more and more put into little boxes and just reading ideas that reinforce what we believe rather than going outside of our comfort zone and reading these different ideas from different sides that we can understand each other. So I know that's what you're doing at the Pro Human Foundation. So I know Bruce asked before when I interrupted, how did you get involved with the Pro Human Foundation?
Oh, I forgot about that question. Yeah.
You were starting to say, right.
So I am one of the visiting fellows for the Mercatus Center's program on pluralism and civil exchange. And so they had a big pluralism summit, and I spoke there along with some just incredible rock stars, Joe Bubman from the Urban Rural Action, a number of really incredible people. Daryl Davis was there. And so I gave a short talk about radical moderation and sort of how I came to that. And there's some biographical stuff that may or may not be relevant for your listeners. But I ran into Lori Warren and a number of other folks from the Pro Human Foundation, Bayan, and a couple others. And they really loved the concept of radical moderation because it seemed to fit really well with what they're trying to do. And I loved the framework that they were putting together and the sort of the values that they had sort of identified as these enduring kind of universal human values. And so when Lori reached out and asked if I wanted to serve on the board of advisors, I said I would love to. So that's the sort of short version. And I know I'm very excited to see how that relationship fleshes out, especially as they start really growing. They've already grown an enormous amount in just the last year and a half. So it'll be really exciting to see what they do moving forward.
Yeah.
You mentioned that they're developing curricula for, schools. Do you think that's something that's going to fly in this day and age when so many of our schools are under scrutiny and in danger of being defunded, and parents are being so vocal about what their kids are learning and exposed to? And I recently read a book by Emmanuel Acho. I hope I'm saying his name right. Difficult Conversations with Jews. And he wrote one before that, Difficult Conversations with Black People. And he recently said that book was just banned from the US Naval Academy. So in this day and age, do you think something like pro-human program that is going to fly?
Well, I think I suspect, I don't know for sure, but I suspect their strategy is to start with private schools because you have much more flexibility with those folks. Public schools, my kids go to public school, they are so constrained in terms of what they can cover and the kinds of things that teachers are allowed or not allowed to do. And it's really frustrating how political it's gotten. we're very lucky that we have a wonderful public school district, but even in our relatively reasonable sort of space, there have been some pretty ugly sort of political fights about parts of the curriculum. So I think probably they will start with the private institutions and then see, if they can get some foothold in some areas. I mean, it's hard, and this is where I think I'm frustrated as a political scientist. I think everyone sees and everyone knows that the political system is not in a good place. I don't think anyone likes the level of polarization or the level of dysfunction that we're seeing right now, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. Nobody's happy with it. But the two major parties have incentives for keeping it that way, because if they keep this sort of two-party power grab, then it becomes really it's easy to sort of sway voters not sway them from one side to another, but it keeps them in sort of the only two games in town. And so one of the problems, of course, is that when you have people who come in with, say, a really amazing K through 12 curriculum, well, that is going to become polarized in our current environment because education is under the protection of whichever party is in power in your state. And so it makes it really hard for people to have conversations about values. So if a Republican supports the curriculum, Democrats are going to hate it. If Democrats support the curriculum, Republicans are going to hate it. And it's no longer about whether the curriculum's good or not. It's about these other totally external things.
Yeah, it gets immediately totalized as soon as, somebody says the trigger word. And suddenly it's like, oh, I can't listen to you anymore. You're on the other side.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a phenomenon. You can I suppose it's another polarization, but it's kind of a meta-polarization. You can look at people who are saying pluralism is good, and then you can look at people who say, no, my side is good. And that's a dichotomy. And of course, we come out of Jewish tradition, and in Jewish tradition, the Talmud is a huge collection of arguments. And they record the arguments. The arguments are the point. There's even stories about, Elu ve'elu, the stories that just say this and this, or that are the words of the living God. They're both, even though they're in opposition to each other, the conflict is important. To embrace that, which again, I don't know exactly what you mean by pluralism, but I'm guessing it's something like that. To embrace the fact that that dirty word diversity, the diversity is actually a feature, not a bug of evolution. Is a very different stance than saying, no, we have to do it the right way, which is my way.
Yeah.
And the trouble, so in sometimes the big dichotomy isn't so much, it's like the extremes against the moderates, as much as it is the Republicans against the Democrats.
Yeah, my background is relevant a little bit to sort of the general question of what pluralism is or what it means. And I think there's a number of ways you can answer that question. But I grew up, my parents are Zen Buddhists. We grew up in a heavily Jewish town in upstate New York. So most of my friends were Jewish. Synagogues were all over the place.
Which town, by the way? I come from Buffalo, so.
Brighton, New York. So it's a suburb of Rochester. It's about 40% Jewish. Yeah. And so we, I went to bat mitzvahs, all the normal things. And so in that context, I was a religious minority. But my uncle and aunt were members of the Church of Latter-day Saints. My grandmother was an evangelical born-again Christian. And so I grew up just sort of recognizing that religious beliefs differed. And our family gatherings were not about who's right or who's wrong, right? It was about the fact that we cared about each other in a community. I certainly didn't go to my Jewish friends' houses and have religious debates with them, right? We accepted our differences. And even though they were differences about the most important things, right? So I'm not rejecting the importance of religion. But to a certain degree, there's actually a really important way in which you can honor the importance of religion by giving it the sort of respect that it deserves and actually not doing the kind of politicization and sort of, arguing that people do about it. But anyway, all this is to say, one of the things that I learned in that environment was that sort of there was this baseline of pluralism where the expectation wasn't that you argue about it. It wasn't that you ignore it. It was that you sort of live in this space, and I would go to the Mormon church and take communion and with my cousins and sing in the choir, and then I would go to the Zen center with my parents, and there was no tension there because it was simply just the way that I lived. And so I don't want this to sound utopian, because I don't think it has to be utopian. But I think there is a way that we can recognize that differences do lead to conflicts. There certainly have been conflicts in my family, particularly my grandmother had a very hard time coming from an evangelical perspective. But I think you can navigate those conflicts if you focus on the importance of the relationship in front of you. And this is, again, sort of getting back to this connection to couples therapy, right? If this relationship is important to you to maintain, if it's important for you to be in community with this person or this group of people, then you have to decide what you can let go. And I think you can let go of a lot. Now, you shouldn't let go of everything, right? But so this isn't relativism, and it's not accepting hate or bigotry or anything like that. But it is saying, let's focus on the importance of this relationship first and foremost.
Yeah. Yeah. Where the notion that the relationship itself, trumps the ideology. I keep avoiding using that word, but it's a good word. I mean, what can I say? Trumps. What can I say? Anyway, but idea, and one of my favorite things to do is to distinguish between ideas and ideology. And basically when ideas harden into ideology, and I've noted they turn into caricatures of the original ideas. It's fascinating.
Yes.
The concept of, religion being a great example. All the religions I know of, generally speaking, include the idea that we should be kind to people, we should be loving to people, we should support people when they're in need. And yet you have the concept of people killing other people because they don't seem to love God the right way. And so that's a bit of a caricature, that is a caricature. And I think that happens in the political domain as well. I find it fascinating with, difficult issues like abortion or affirmative action is one of my favorite examples, where clearly affirmative action is absolutely necessary, important, and clearly it's harmful and does all kinds of difficult things, and all of those things are true at the same time. Damn, and it's humbling. It's like, wow, if you listen to all the various opinions on that, they're all right, and yet they're very much in conflict. I haven't got a good solution to that, but I think my solution to that is to marvel at the lack of solution, and then get on with it as one has to do in a family. That's what one has to do in a family. Well, you get on with it, even though, the people can differ on important things, but somehow they manage to get on with it. And that, sometimes that's the best we can do.
Well, and I think the example of abortion, or another one I sometimes use with my students is, that Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter, right? We've set up this caricature of this conversation. But when it comes to abortion, I think it's such an interesting example, right? Because we have this obviously deep moral problem. It's one of the few times in human life where two human beings share the same body. This is not like it's very normal, but it's also bizarrely abnormal, right? So it challenges all of our understandings about autonomy and agency. And I think to me, if you look at the average American, right, the average American actually shares in common fairly standard views about abortion, which is that most people are comfortable with it very early in pregnancy and then very uncomfortable with it pretty much after the age of viability. That's, if you ask most Americans, they fit into this bucket. And yet somehow we have managed to characterize it as though it's this binary choice. You are either pro-life or you're pro-choice.
And both of those terms are very much designed to be polarizing.
Yes, exactly.
They're brilliant terms. Like, so if you're not pro-life, you're against life. And if you're not pro-choice, you're against choice. And that's nonsense. Where I think the number I've seen is like 80% or something when you were describing the sort of common
it's very high.
Yeah, it's very high. Yeah.
Yeah. So, to your point, I think it's hard. It's a genuinely hard human problem, right? So why not have conversations about the fact that it's a genuinely hard problem? And then why not have bigger conversations around, well, why is it that people, for example, feel as though they can't keep their baby if they do end up in this situation? What are the kinds of things that we could change? Maybe you'll never eradicate it, but what about different ways of supporting people, right? Like, how do we think in this way if we do believe that it's a moral quandary? But you lose all of that if you just get into these two these two buckets.
Well, yeah,
And I
if
think,
you insist, it's not a moral quandary. If you insist,
yes,
no, there's
yeah,
only one right way. And,
yes.
that's the problem with the ideological stance that says, well, from the moment of fertilization, whatever that is, ask a biologist. I'm not even sure that's as clear as people think it is, but whatever. From that moment that we now have a human being that has to have all the rights of a human being. In
Hmm.
Jewish law, traditionally, if there is they are not at all permissive. There's no such thing as pro-choice in Jewish law, traditional Jewish law. But if the fetus is threatening the mother, it's not allowed to do abortion. It's required to do abortion.
Hmm.
So and yet
Yep.
that doesn't work with a traditional Catholic stance,
Right.
and it's a quandary. But of course, that's the problem. It's not presented as a quandary. It's presented as an absolute.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly.
Wow. What else should we be asking you about?
I don't know. This has been a great conversation. I actually have a question for you. I mean, what are some of the most difficult, as a couples therapist, like what are some of the most difficult situations for you to navigate as you
Yeah.
sort of help support people?
It's interesting. I mean, my most recent book is about betrayal and forgiveness because well
Mm,
over half, depending on how you define betrayal, but well over half of the couples I work with in the first session are dealing with something that they would call a betrayal. Often it's just regular old infidelity.
mm,
Somebody had sex with somebody and their deal with each other was monogamy. But there's all kinds of other types of betrayal. I it's funny. I'm not sure I would call those the hardest ones for me to deal with. I think the
mm.
hardest ones for me to deal with. I remember around the pandemic, dealing with folks that had radically different ideas about vaccination. That was really
Oh,
hard, in
yeah.
particular because it freaked me out. And of course
Hmm.
that's the key for the therapist has to be the one in the room who's not freaked out. And there were some things early on during COVID where I would get freaked out
Mhm.
by someone's attitude, and I'd be thinking, "How could you be thinking that? That's like evil or whatever." I was
Hmm.
sort of, but after I got hold of myself around that, that got a little easier. But that's it's the political difference stuff, which again I think I've gotten better at over the years. That's been really hard, especially since 2016. I didn't,
Hmm.
I've been doing this, they say, in private practice now for over 30 years, and I don't remember before that political differences between couples being all that big a deal. I like
Hmm.
to cite this. I was born in 1951. I remember the 1960 election, Kennedy and Nixon, and I remember my father voted for Nixon and my mother voted for Kennedy, and they just laughed about it. It
Hmm.
wasn't like this crisis in the family. It was just funny. They said, I guess we canceled each other's vote, didn't we? Ha ha.
Yeah.
It was
Isn't that
funny.
like we can't be in the same room
Yeah,
anymore in the same
they
marriage
were
with each
smiling.
other?
They were not enemies.
Right.
That what I have seen since 2016, where I've seen couples who are split politically. Wow, that it's led to divorce in some cases. I
Hmm.
can't support you if you are like that. I can't be with you if you are like that. It was that kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's difficult stuff.
That's something we see, and political scientists are actually really worried about this because we call it assortative mating, and it's when people mate along, certain kinds of criteria. And it used to be religion, right? So, back in the
Yeah,
day, you would marry within your religion, and that was just how life went. But you could marry easily across political lines, right? Because religion was
Yeah.
the fact that you
hmm
shared the same religious values was the really important thing. Now it's much more common for people to marry outside their religion than it is for them to marry outside their political party. That is really shocking, and
Yeah.
that I think that means that we are now dug in a way that we have not been in the past. And it's going to make
yeah,
political conversations much, much harder. I mean, if you think about it, growing up in a house with two liberal parents or two conservative parents versus growing up in a house with a liberal and a conservative parent, the liberal conservative home, you hear the opposing side and you care about the opposing, right? You hear different perspectives. And so you're seeing at least part of the picture. Whereas if
yeah,
you're only in a solo liberal family or a solo conservative family, you're not presented with the alternatives. You're not presented with the trade-offs, right? Like what are the things you lose if you take this particular view? What are the things that you lose if you take this set of values as the highest good? And so I think it starts to actually really undermine the early childhood education and pluralism that we want kids to have, which is people need to be able to see how people settle political disagreements. And usually the way that you did that was your parents or your parents' friends, people having friendly arguments about politics over dinner. I don't know if people do that anymore. I feel like it's,
It's hard, yeah, because of the polarization. It's so hard to have a
yeah,
friendly conversation across that difference. We just saw that, remember, with some
yeah.
friends when we were a few weeks ago. I sort of stepped in to invite a different approach on in the conversation because these two guys that have been friends way longer than I've known either one of them were about to kill each other,
Yeah,
and it is much more difficult than it used to be,
yeah.
and even that concept of, you have one liberal, one conservative parent. I'm thinking about my parents now. Again, in the grand scheme of the country, growing up in Jewish Buffalo, it would be considered liberal, but not the way
Hmm.
it is now. And as I say,
Yeah.
my father voted for Nixon, my mother voted for Kennedy, and I wouldn't even say he was the more conservative one and she was the more liberal one. It just,
Hmm.
Well, when you
you
think
know,
about it, Eisenhower wasn't sure even which party he was going to
yeah,
affiliate with.
exactly.
That's how closely aligned his thinking was with each side. So,
And then the term that was in the days when the term liberal Republican was not an oxymoron. I remember
Hmm.
that we had
Jacob
Nelson Rutherford and
Javits, and
Jacob
yep,
Javits, and that we had these liberal Republicans elected from New York State, and so
we still
all
do in Vermont,
and we
actually.
still do well. No, I don't
Well,
think I don't think Scott would be called a liberal per se,
no, but we
but in the
that's true.
national politics, he would be a
Yes.
flaming leftist. So
Yes. Yeah.
it's
Yep.
funny how that works. The point being, it's just difficult. It's difficult because we define ourselves politically much the way we used to define ourselves religiously. I think that
Yep.
phenomenon where you're seeing there's lots of intermarriage religiously reflects the relative lessening of importance of religion.
Right.
And
Yep.
I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It is an interesting thing because so many people will, a lot of folks I've talked to who, I mean, they know I'm Jewish and I'm very active in our Jewish community, and they will often express this sense of, well, I don't have anything like that. I don't have any religious background. When of course they have a religious background, they just don't think of it as it was
As
so much a
theirs.
backdrop, they don't think of it as actually important. And so
Yep.
they don't think of it as a rich heritage that everybody really has if they could see it that way.
Yeah,
Hmm.
but I think we're losing something with that too. And when I was teaching and I would go into schools because they would always want me to come around and, give the Jewish perspective on things. And when I started going around, you can usually get a lot of kids knowing Bible history and Bible stories. Toward the end of my tenure, going to schools, there were fewer and fewer kids that knew who these characters were in the Bible. So they did not have that same frame of reference of
Yep.
of like a Judeo-Christian historicity.
Yep.
Oh, yeah, you're losing something because Vermont is, I think, like what the least
It's the least
religious state.
religious state in the country. Yeah.
So it's no
Hmm.
wonder, you've got lots of non-affiliated Jewish kids and Christian kids out there, and we've got a lot of new Muslims who've moved into the state, and they tend to be a lot more
They're
religious.
affiliated. We live next door to the mosque, actually. So
Yeah, and
Yep.
Friday afternoons during
yeah.
Juma, it is packed.
Yep.
But the Muslim kids are all, going into their Muslim training. What I don't know what the equivalency of Hebrew school, I guess Muslim school. Um, so they're getting it, but a lot of, as I said, Jewish and Christian kids are not affiliating, so they're not
Hmm.
getting. I don't know how. I know in the South it's different because there is a very much a very strong Christian association. When I lived in North Carolina, same thing, as a Jewish person, most Jews do affiliate because, it's either you got to go to church or you don't, or you go to your
Yep.
synagogue. So, they would always ask me, which Jewish church do you go to? So, so I think it's a little
Yep.
bit stronger in the South, but here up north, yeah, you're not seeing a lot of kids and, a lot of families affiliating anymore with anything religious. So you don't have that commonality in the culture. So you're going to the politics, you're going to the things that
Hmm.
are drawing people apart.
Yeah. Well, and even in the South, the religion has become so partisan.
Mm.
Hmm.
There's a great, I want to say it was Tocqueville, but I'm not entirely sure. But I think it was Tocqueville who said, the Americans separate politics and the church from government, not to protect politics from religion, but to protect religion from politics,
Exactly. That
right?
was the original idea. Yeah.
Because if you're under, if you're supposedly in a congregation, right, all
Right.
sharing the same kind of value, then you don't want this splitting force, right? But that has definitely happened in the South, and I think we're seeing that in actually a lot of the large. I think the Methodists are facing these kinds of schisms. I think some of the major Baptist. I mean, I think they've already kind of had this politicized split.
David
So
French
it
had a,
is.
yeah. Did you see
No, go
David
ahead.
French's piece in the Times a few days ago? We're recording this
No.
in May of 2025 for anybody who's getting this later. But yeah, he had a piece. He's an evangelical Christian, but but I should say writes for the New York Times. That
Hmm.
seems somehow like a bit of a a bit of a surprise.
Yeah.
But he was bemoaning the fact that what used to be evangelical Christianity, what held people together was the notion of Christianity, and especially as understood by evangelicals. And he said, now what holds people together is the Republican Party. And
Yeah.
so many of the stances that the Republican Party are taking are, in his view, opposite to what
Yeah, it's
evangelical
antithetical
Christianity
to
would
it. Yeah.
say. And yet,
Yes.
it really seems to have morphed into that political thing as opposed to a religious thing.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and it will be a very hard cycle to break because once we are in these silos, it's going to be really hard to get out. Um,
Yeah.
so I don't know what the right answer is.
Well, I think a good start is the work that you're doing on the Pro Human Foundation. So I'll put in a
Well,
plug for that.
yes, they're doing
I should
wonderful work, and
mention, yeah, I just want to mention Braver Angels too, which is another
yes,
organization that is doing that kind of work as well.
yeah, there's a number of and I actually have a bunch on my website, laurenkhall.com, but there's a resources tab. But there's Braver Angels, there's Bridge USA, there's Builders. There's also some really neat movements happening. Solution journalism is one of my favorites. It's journalists who are really trying to move away from polarized and sort of problem focused journalism and instead focus on people who are actually solving problems, people who are working together, people who are, so instead of always highlighting divisive negative stories, really focusing on
Hmm.
sort of
Yeah.
or at least highlighting what the solutions could be. So I think we're actually seeing a network of organizations like the Pro Human Foundation that are really excited and dedicated to trying to overcome these divides. What I think then next has to happen is then there needs to be more linkages between those organizations, and I think we're
Mhm.
starting to see a little bit of that. But um, it's slow going once civil society has fractured like this. It's hard to build it back up.
Yeah. So you mentioned your website, laurenkhull.com. I said that
Yeah,
we'll make sure to put that in our show notes. And your Substack, which I've really been enjoying. If you can, why don't I put in a plug for that as
yeah,
well?
thanks. Yeah, it's the Radical Moderate's Guide to Life. And then I also just recently started a podcast that you should be able to find. It's linked on my Substack, called "We Made This Political," which is with Laura Forcom, who's the president of the Independent Center. And so we talk about sort of motherhood and politics and all sorts of things. And she's a social psychologist, so it's a fun grouping. But yeah, so please check out my Substack. This was a really fun conversation.
Yeah. Well,
It
thank you
was
so
great
much
to
for
have
doing
you.
this.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that fascinating interview with Lauren Hall. Boy, we went off on lots of fascinating subjects. So she is really brilliant. So
Yes, she is, and
we
it really,
appreciated having
and
that conversation with her.
I did too, and I'm glad she's doing the work she's doing. You know, it's
Mm-hmm.
really neat to see that happening. And some of the stuff she talked about near the end there about very, and she's got them on her website, laurenkhull.com, various organizations
Lauren
that are
K.
doing
Hall.
Lauren K. What did I say?
We were Hill.
Hill.
We were talking about that earlier.
LaurenKHall.com. Sorry about that. Anyway, she's got got that information on her website, and these organizations that are doing this kind of work that is
Mm-hmm.
about depolarizing, that's about crossing those bridges, and
Right, and
it's
like you said,
inspiring.
it comes up a lot with your couples
It
work.
does.
So, yeah, we know a lot of couples out there are hurting because they don't have these similar political views, and it's very polarizing right now. So
Absolutely.
that might be a good, if you're one of those couples, you might want to check out some of the organizations she mentioned.
You might, and of course you can check out my practice, by the way, which you can find out about at brucechalmer.com. And what should people do if they want to make a suggestion to us about a topic or a guest?
Yes, you can go to our website, ctn7.com. That's CT in Couples Therapy and the numeral 7, ctn7.com.
So do that and let us know if you'd give us some suggestions, give us some feedback. And so until next time,
remember, be kind,
don't panic,
and have faith.